This is the story of a young man, a dreamer who in 1961 went blind. Plunged into darkness at the age of 19, he made a vow to live his life to somehow see an end to blindness. That very year, President John F. Kennedy set a bold timeline for what many considered a lunatic goal: put a man on the moon within the decade. Audacious words that inspired a generation's keenest minds with possibility, including that of our young dreamer. Driven by his vow, he pushed through his darkness with academic and entrepreneurial vigor. Now, half a century later, just as JFK set human ingenuity to its highest task, our dreamer issues an equally bold challenge to the keen minds of this generation: end blindness within the decade, the year 2020. To help speed this dream along to reality, there is a reward established by Friends of the Dreamer, and that reward is gold. $2 million initially for the most foundational medical breakthrough in ending blindness. This is a worldwide appeal to the brilliant minds of this generation to join the ranks of those who've pushed the human race forward with their vivid ingenuity, insatiable curiosity, and boundless hope. Only 2,978 days separated JFK's lofty call from mankind's giant leap. And in 2,978 more, our dreamer shall see his dream become reality, and we shall see the end of blindness. 2020.
All engine running. Liftoff.
Hello, welcome. Thank you all for joining us. By way of background, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rahul Mughal. I am co-chair of the iConnections Investment Institute, along with Ted Sides. The iConnections Investment Institute is dedicated to knowledge sharing, premier education, and real-time interaction among members of the asset management industry. Today, it is my real honor, and I'm truly humbled to introduce Dr. Sanford Greenberg. He is the chairman of the Board of Governors of the Johns Hopkins Wilmer Eye Institute, the largest clinical and research enterprise in ophthalmology in the United States of America. He is author of Hello Darkness, My Old Friend, How Daring Dreams and Unyielding Friendship Turn One Man's Blindness into an Extraordinary Vision for Life. And he is also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Interviewing Sandy today, as he's affectionately known, is Mark Roberts. Mark is the Chief Investment Officer for Ironsides Asset Advisors, and he'll be leading the conversation with Sandy today. So, gentlemen, over to you. We really look forward to this. Thank you.
Raul, thank you very much. It is a pleasure and an honor. I'm fortunate enough to, from time to time, get to spend a fair amount of time with Sandy and have conversations. And so I look forward to kind of sharing a conversation today with my friend. Sandy, I'm going to jump right in. Raul mentioned the book, and we're going to talk about portions of the book, but we're going to try to explore maybe even some pieces outside the book as well. Could you maybe start and help with the development of, tell me a little bit about kind of life in Buffalo and growing up in Buffalo. Your father passed away when you were at a young age, and your mom was really supportive. Can you share a bit about growing up in Buffalo and the development that she had, the development influences she had on you?
I'd be happy to, but first I'd like to thank Raul for making this possible. And about Mark Roberts, difficult to find enough praiseworthy words to talk about him. I know this, that at a time when it is particularly difficult to find role models for our children and grandchildren, I take great pride in counting among my friends Mark, whose life, intellect, character, and commitment embody all that is best in America.
Very kind, very kind.
As to my own life, it started out we lived in a poor neighborhood. our flimsy wooden house would hardly satisfy anyone, but it did for me because of while there were no concrete pillars, there were other pillars, 4 of them, that I think taught me how to live. My father, as you mentioned, Mark, died when I was 5. He had escaped Nazi Germany in 1939 and came to the States, was a tailor. And one of the sweet memories I have of him, and I don't have that many, was when he would put me on a chair in the middle of the room, suspend a stick of gum over my head and say, "This is coming from heaven." His death devastated me. I was 5 years old. He left my mother, Sarah, with $54 and 3 children under the age of 5 to raise. Shortly after my father's death, my mother, who took me along to go see a social service agency, and they said they would be thrilled to help us out, so long as she would separate the 3 of us and put them into 3 separate orphanages. My mother would have none of it.
What a wonderful influence. What a wonderful comment on family your mom was on that.
Surely was. But several years later, we had a terrific break. My uncle Carl married my mother, and that was about 10 years into my first decade. Was the end of my first decade, and life simply changed. We moved into a middle-class neighborhood, and we even had a television. So it was very exciting for my brother Joel, my sister Ruth, to live there. And shortly thereafter, my other sister Brenda was born.
So you progressed along and you excelled in high school. But also talk about another great influence. Talk about Sue a little bit.
Yeah, Sue. Well, that's part of what happened to me in May of '51. When we moved to this neighborhood, naturally we had to go to a new school. And the first day I walked into class, I looked across the aisle and saw someone that was so beautiful that I could hardly contain myself. I tried, but I'm sure she knew that I liked her. So 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade went by, and she never talked to me. Well, it really was the most reasonable thing in the world, because I never talked to her. And one day, there was a spelling bee hosted by the Buffalo Evening News, and Sue was up to bat first, and the word was silhouette, and she misspelled it. So there I was standing and asking myself, do I flub it and out of respect for her? And I said, no, I can't do that. So I had to take the consequences and spelled it correctly. And that was a major breakthrough, because the first time we had a real conversation. Then we went on to high school together. And one of the most seminal moments of my life is when I asked her to join me at the annual cancer charity ball. And when she accepted, I was in total disbelief. She and I have now been married for 58 years.
That's fabulous. That's fabulous. So life progresses along.
Yes.
College, Columbia. Why Columbia? How did that work out? How did that occur? How did you end up at Columbia? And what were early days at Columbia like?
I wound up at Columbia because I wanted to have a dual program, one that would permit me to understand more about my religion, and the other would sweep me into a secular project called the Enlightenment. And I was so taken by Columbia that I couldn't pursue the other path, which was being conducted at the Jewish Theological Seminary a few blocks away. And when I walked through the gates of Columbia on Broadway and 116th, I knew that my life was changing as I walked through the gates. I was being initiated into the most treasured secrets of knowledge over the millennia and generations.
And you also had a talent for making friends and identifying others. Was it just the age and what was going on during that period of time? Or was it serendipity, or was it something you cultivated as you made friends? You have a number of very kind of fascinating and lifelong friends that we'll discuss here in a second.
Yeah, well, friendship's a big deal to me. In fact, the word friend is in the title of my book. And when I arrived at Columbia, I certainly had no talent for selecting anything. And one day, this young man, boy, 17, walked over to me and said, "Hi, I'm Art Garfunkel." And I said, "I'm Sandy Greenberg." And that was that. And we began having serious conversations on the way to class and after that. And the same was true of another young man named Jerry Spire. Arthur was a more serious person than Jerry, but Jerry knew how to enjoy life, particularly college life. And I learned from both of them.
And they became lifelong friends, obviously.
Yes, sir.
So talk about a bit of the friendship and the bond that developed with Arthur, and you all made a pact with one another. Do you mind sharing a bit of that pact? And that'll come back to play a little bit later on too.
Yeah, that's true. Well, one of the most important events in my college days was totally unexpected. After a humanities class, Arthur and I walked outside. It was at Amsterdam and 110. And he asked me to come over to the curb and look at a patch of grass. Look at how light illuminates the beauty and complexity of its colors. And I'm standing there, and I know that my other friends would not accept that kind of thing because they're interested in philosophy, politics, sports, women, and it should be reversed. And I knew at that moment that something of significance was being granted to me. But as Mark implied, I didn't know how important it was. About a month later, Arthur walked over to me and said, "Let's room together." Now, he had joined a rival fraternity of mine, and so I didn't understand what he was saying or doing. And so he gave me 5 reasons, one of which, the most significant of which, was that he suggested we create a pact that if either of us was in extremis, the other would come to his aid regardless of his circumstance. And that was another defining moment in my life. And I'm sure he thought nothing of it. But for me, it transformed my life because I began looking at the world quite differently. And still do.
So let's set the scene a little bit. It's freshman year in college. You're studying. You're being exposed to all kinds of different interests and everything. You're a good athlete. You're capable. You are not having any sight or eye issues at that point. And then in, I guess, was it the summer or at some point you began having some eye irritation type issues? Maybe if you can kind of walk me through that and kind of walk us up to that spot.
Well, I think the summary of what you were saying, life was simply golden for me. Everything seemed to fall in place with my goals and objectives in life. But then I was pitching in the 7th inning of a baseball game right before my junior year, and my eyes steamed up, became cloudy, and I tried to shake it off, and the next pitch I threw almost hit the batter, and my eyes remained steamy. And so I stumbled off the field and dropped to the ground, where fortunately my girlfriend Sue was there, and I put my head on her lap, and she said, "What's wrong?" I said, "I don't know. I've had this interruption in sight, and it obviously made it impossible for me to continue pitching." In any event, I went to see one ophthalmologist who told me I had allergic conjunctivitis, and gave me some drops that were ineffectual. Then I went to another ophthalmologist, and as it turns out, he agreed and said, "You do have allergic conjunctivitis, so I'm going to give you some topical steroids, neocortisone." And I started taking them because, after all, I'm pretty invincible. I got the whole world out there. It's waiting for me. I'm at Columbia. And this is my junior year, the year which, the way Columbia works, you must succeed because that'll determine your future, right, your junior year. I walked into my final exam. My friend Arthur took me in there. He had seen, obviously, that I was having trouble seeing. And he sat me down at the desk, and I started writing the answer to an essay question, which I squinted very hard to read. And for an hour, I wrote and wrote, ignoring the blue lines. And I looked up, and suddenly there was nothing. I looked at my watch, I shook my body, my head, rolled my eyes, did whatever I thought might bring me back to being a fully sighted person. But there were a few minutes of frustration, and I decided there was no alternative but to leave. And so I went to the front of the gym, and the proctors started laughing at me because I told them I couldn't see. And he said, that's one of the greatest jokes I've ever heard. What a terrific way of getting out of an exam. I said, sir, I can't see. He just didn't believe me. So I turned around, I walked back to try and get my coat at my chair, and I wound up stumbling over chairs and students, and finally got there. And when I came back, he appreciated what I was saying. And in a word, I went back to the dormitory, packed, and took a train back home to Buffalo, where Sue greeted me and took me to my home, where I had to finally fess up to my mother that things were not so good. And I was being cut open. And the worst part is I was being cut open in front of my brother Joel, my sister Ruth, my sister Brenda, and my mother and father. And there was not a damn thing I could do to hide it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I'm going to jump ahead a small amount. I am going to encourage folks, please read these sections in the book. I definitely want to get to a few items with Sandy, though. So post blindness, post the surgery, there was that difficult period of time where, what do I do now, and how all that played out, and you had a visitor that basically kind of helped shake you on that.
mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. My college roommate, Arthur, flew up to Buffalo where I was recuperating. And he said, Sanford, you must come back to Columbia. And I said, Arthur, I don't think you understand. I can't see. I have no resources of any sort. My father, after all, was a junk dealer. And we weren't flushed with capital, shall we say. And fortunately, Columbia had given me a full tuition scholarship. I said, I can't do it. He said, no, you can. You are going to come back with me. And we were walking down my street, and he kept repeating that. And we made absolutely no progress for the first hour. But it was wonderful having him there because it reminded me of the days we spent walking on College Walk back at school. And then he turned to me. He said, I don't think you get it. I said, I get it. I think you're the one who doesn't get it. He said, we made an agreement. We agreed and shook hands on a deal that if either of us was an extremist, the other would come to his aid. All you've been doing this past hour is talking about your situation. But if I go back to Columbia without you, what will my life be like? Simply stated, Sanford, I need you there.
That's so powerful. You've told me that story before, and I certainly wanted to share it with others. But every single time I hear that story, you're so blessed to have a friendship like that, and everyone should be blessed to have a friendship like that. When you got back to Columbia, Arthur still had a little bit of work to do, and maybe I should lay a little bit of groundwork right now. Arthur at this point is an architectural student. He may have sung a little bit while he was in high school, but really his focus was being an architectural student at this point, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. You know what? Maybe this is a good time if we can cue the video. And this is a unique and special story after Sanford had gotten back to Columbia and something that Art did with him. So if we could cue the video, please.
He was diagnosed with glaucoma, too late to save his sight.
After you go blind, you end up going back home.
Yes.
You're in Buffalo.
Yes,
but
sir.
Your friend does not give up on you.
He surely did not.
I went to work on that negative feeling. I went to work on it. I thought I would bring you back to the ongoing of prosaic, regular life. What do we have to do? Return to school.
He walked me around the city, took me to class, and most important, he would read to me regularly. He said, "Sanford, darkness is going to read to you today." Or, "Sanford, darkness is going to read to you from the Iliad." And I suppose he meant that for me, his voice was emerging from the darkness. And actually the reason we're here is because that's how this book was born. Hello, darkness, my old friend.
Simon and Garfunkel's song hit #1 on the Billboard charts 6 years later in 1966. Unrelated to Garfunkel's and Greenberg's friendship, but Garfunkel becoming the light for his friend.
Al, close your eyes for a minute and think of yourself now in Grand Central Station, and you're blind.
Art had left his friend behind to ride the subway alone, although he was right behind him the whole time.
Let me hover behind him for safety and see if I can save him before any trouble and let him extend what it's like to maneuver blind as a new guy.
I was able, by asking people and keeping my hands in front of me so that I looked like either a sleepwalker or a drunkard. And I made it through, and when I got up to Broadway and 116th, I walked through the iron gates of Columbia and I bumped into a man. And of course, it was Arthur. He had followed me the entire way.
His friendship gave Sandy Greenberg his vision for life.
He gave me a gift that's lasted my entire life. If you can get through the subway as a blind person, then there are no limits to what you could accomplish. That was the defining moment of my life, because after that, there were no limits.
Greenberg went on to a lifetime of accomplishments in a career as an entrepreneur and in public service, working with politicians and celebrities along the way. And for the last 8 years, his wife Sue runs a campaign donating money to end blindness. Did you have any idea that the guy that you roomed with
would be this lifelong friend who achieved so much, who has achieved so much?
Al, I can give you the honest word in one answer. Absolutely, yes. Sanford really had vision from the moment I met him.
What a wonderful clip. That's great. And obviously you can see why I wanted to insert it. We've spent 30 minutes working on kind of the early part and some of the foundational portions of your life. But I want to spend the next 30 minutes really kind of talking about taking this gift of blindness that you were given and what you have actually done with it and how you have made the world a better place. I'm going to finish, I'm going to start a bit by, let's stay at Columbia for a little bit. You finished Columbia, president of the class, Phi Beta Kappa. Talk a little bit about that last year, that senior year at Columbia, and getting through and prepping yourself for the work and prepping yourself for your life's work.
There's not much to say other than it was simply dogged work. The textbooks, the tapes, trying to get to class, walk back. Arthur was true to his promise. He walked me around the city, helped me with my class notes. and was always there. If I split open my shins, he would bandage them. If I fell down the stairs, as I did, he'd make sure that I was upright and not seriously damaged. That's it's simply stated. That's what it was like. Up early in the morning, go to class, come back, read, or have somebody read you the textbooks and the other books you want to read. And then at midnight, you start listening to your tape recorder, because I taped all the classes. And then I also took time at about, 1 or 2 in the middle of the night to write letters to Sue and my family.
There was a rigor and a discipline, and I'll ask the obvious question that's carried forward, correct? And how have you applied that rigor and discipline throughout the rest of your life?
Well, I think it starts with making a decision about what you want to do. And if you really want to do it, everything else will follow. And so I decided to go to graduate school, to study at Oxford, went to the Columbia Business School to get an MBA. And I did those serially. And then when it came time to go out into the business world, I had been fortunate in the sense that when I was trying to listen to the books people had taped, I had a reel-to-reel tape recorder. And so I would turn the reels to hear information come faster. But all I wound up with was distortion. And so I was so frustrated, and I thought that perhaps I could invent a way for information to be transmitted to a listener at far more rapid rates than without distortion than they could get from listening simply to tapes. And that was my senior year. That was the idea for me that haunted me. And during the summer, I kept working on it best I could. And then when I got up to Harvard Graduate School, fortunately, some of my readers were engineers and physicists. And I had taken a course in physics with Professor Leon Letterman, who had won a Nobel laureate.
Right.
And that course provided the intellectual platform for me to go forward and try and understand this new technology. And I asked, or thought, that we've been communicating principally by speaking and listening for the last 50,000 years. So why couldn't we convert the mechanical energy of the voice box and larynx into electrical energy? And that's when I decided to invent the machine. And so I worked all during the 60s and finally got a patent for the compression expansion hearing in speech in May of 1969.
But that wasn't the only thing you were doing during that time, correct?
Right. Are you referring to anything specifically?
Well, no, I you have a gift of being able to work on kind of multiple projects and compartmentalize
Yeah.
and work through various items.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, at the same time, you had been engaged, you had worked, I guess, I believe that you had worked on the Kennedy campaign, or were going to work on the Kennedy campaign, and certainly, the space race was going on during that time frame. So there was kind of an interconnection there. So I'm curious how that all played together.
Well, I was so inspired by President Kennedy's declaration that we should go to the moon and return a man safely to Earth within the decade, knowing full well that we had no idea how to do that. It was a dream. And 2,970 days after May 25th, 61, Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. I was flabbergasted. I felt what I took away from that experience was to understand if you have a goal, then your dream is more likely to happen than not. And so everything, for example, when I was entering my senior year, my sole purpose for living at that time was to graduate with my class on time, because I had missed the second half of my junior year. And that's in part why, and I insisted that my life would be a failure if I didn't get there. And fortunately, I did. So setting goals to me was always a very important thing in whatever part of life you're interested in.
So along that time, you worked as a White House fellow, correct?
Yes.
That was kind of simultaneous with all that. So you have kind of a job, but you're also a White House fellow for the Johnson administration at that point in time, correct?
Right. And that was, I seem to be telling you that there were many defining moments in my life. And as I'm talking, I'm realizing that they all happen to be true. That going to work in the White House was a thrilling opportunity. I was 25 years old, and I walked into this mansion and couldn't believe I was there. And then as I became more acclimated and got to meet a few people, there was a day when, President Johnson was an interesting man, to say the least. But you knew that if he called you in and put his arm around your shoulder and squeezed you in tightly and said, "Let us reason together," you were finished. That's it. So fortunately, when his secretary called me up and said, "The president wants to see you," and I called Sue immediately and said, "I'm finished. It's all over. I'm coming home." And quite the reverse, when I got to the Oval Office, he put his arm around me and did squeeze me and told me how proud he was of me because I had won something or other. And I found out later that when he was having negotiations with Prime Minister Fanfani of Italy, the issue of a technology gap between Western Europe and the United States was on his agenda. So he set up a task force of Bill Hewlett of Hewlett Packard, Don Horning, the president's science advisor, and this young kid, from Buffalo. And we went over and met with the prime minister's ministers, ministers of technology, and with our 6 Western European allies. And one day, I was sitting in a meeting in Germany, and the Minister of Technology, I believe his name was Stoltenberg, said, you know, we train unskilled people to operate and maintain the most sophisticated technological weaponry. And I sat there stupefied. You train unskilled people to do some of the most difficult work in the world. How is that possible? When I went back to Washington, I first talked to Willard Wirtz, who was Secretary of Labor at the time, because he was very interested in manpower training. And I told him what I discovered and wanted his input. I also spoke to Bill Moyers, who was then the press secretary and special assistant, and probably the second most powerful person in Washington at the time. And I told him the idea that I was thinking about, and then I went to Orville Freeman, Secretary of Agriculture, and he decided to join, as did Jim Goddard, who ran the Food and Drug Administration. And without boring you with the details, what we all did is we built a machine, a general purpose system simulator, a specialized computer that would enable you to train people so that they could operate and maintain not only the most sophisticated technological weaponry, but also for use in the commercial sector, such as operating fossil fuel generators. And after I left government, and we all left government, I started this company called EDP Technology to do exactly that, to build these specialized machines. And this is crazy. After a number of years, a couple of my friends asked me to do them a favor. So I left the company, sold my interest, and this past week, I discovered that the company that now owned my technology just sold it to private investors for $2.8 billion. And so I had a wonderful feeling because I think I contributed value to our society, and by employing many, many people and providing a new form of technology that would be extremely helpful, particularly in a time when we are shifting as a society more and more to technological work.
Well, I think Arthur's words are so true. I mean, you have such vision. It's not that you're a mechanical engineer. It's not that you worked in the tech industry. You just have vision, and you were able to kind of pull this together. Throughout your life, you've had mentors, and I'm sure that you have mentored folks. And I count myself as a very happy recipient of that. But can you talk a little bit about the mentors for you as you were coming through this time frame?
Yes, I would be happy to, because they were extraordinary gentlemen and friends. The most significant was David Rockefeller. He actually financed the beginning of the White House Fellows Program, and he was chairman of the commission. And so I got to know David, and I don't know what happened. Maybe it was the first handshake or the third meeting, but here he was at the time, literally the richest man in the world. And I can assure you, Mark, that I was the poorest kid in the world. And he took me under his wing for all these decades till a couple of years ago. And I don't understand why to this day. It was an act of such magnanimity, such caring that I haven't gotten over. And we would see each other regularly. And particularly when he retired from Chase, as it's Chairman, in 1980, we would meet for lunch in New York often, and occasionally at his home in Pocantico Hills. And about 2 years ago, I got a call asking if I would join him for lunch in his country home. And I, of course, said yes. So I drove up to Pocantico Hills. I walked in, and he came over to me using a walker, which I had never seen him do. And he gave me a big hug. And he asked me if I would kiss him on the cheek, which I did. And then we sat down and had a couple of hours of wonderful conversation over lunch. And as I was leaving, he got up and with his walker came over to where I was sitting and started hugging me, and said, "Will you kiss me on the other cheek?" And I lost it.
Sure.
It was his way of saying a final goodbye. 2 months later, he died.
What would you say? Your conversations were wide ranging. What would you say did you learn business? Did you learn family? Did you learn relationships? What areas did he help you with?
Certainly, I didn't do business with him for many, many years after we met, because I would go to New York and we would just have tutorials, talk about anything and everything, philosophy, politics, finance, business. And I took a special trip up from Washington just to go spend an hour with him. And the most worthwhile time I spent in the years that I was growing up. And his advice was, in regard to philanthropy, lead with your heart, and everything good will follow. Secondly, if you are passionate about the sciences and the humanities, then pursue them both, because they are both central to our civilization. And then finally, he said, find young people around the country and support them, but you must do it anonymously.
What great lessons. What great lessons. Now, I've been asked to ask you this. Who taught you to negotiate? And I understand that you had kind of a famous negotiation with Colonel Tom Parker and Elvis, if you don't mind sharing that story.
If we could turn off the camera for 10 minutes, that'd be great.
You can give us the edited version.
No, okay, I'll give you truncated. Actually, this ties into David Rockefeller. I have a special place in my heart when it comes to my friends. I define friendship very differently from what most people do, I think, which is why I've had 60 years of intimate friendships with several people. And David called me one day and said he was having a problem, that they had given money to a man, an entrepreneur in Cleveland, who built the Cleveland Coliseum. David said, the guy's overruns are horrendous. Can you help me out? So I went to Cleveland. The building was half built. I hired the right people, finished the building, and then negotiated to get an NHL team. Now, if you know anything about coliseum or arenas, you know that you need 2 anchor tenants. It's like a shopping center. And in addition, you need entertainment. So I had been, and I'm not embarrassed to mention that I was a big fan of Elvis Presley. And one day we were having a meeting at the Coliseum. And I said, gentlemen, why can't we get Elvis Presley to come and perform at our venue? I said, well, we never thought of asking. I said, well, why don't we ask? And there was a concert promoter named Jerry Weintraub. I think he's pretty famous now, but he had a company called Concerts West. And I was in touch with him because he had done some concerts for us that were also very good. And I said, we'd like to get Elvis to the Coliseum. How can we do it? So, well, you have to talk to Colonel Parker. I said, okay, I'll talk to whoever you recommend. So I go to Cleveland, and he is in the penthouse of this hotel. The room is gargantuan. And across the room, slightly elevated, is a chair in which a man is sitting there like this. A royal pose, indeed. He said, Mr. Greenberg, I understand that you want to have Mr. Presley perform in your building. I said, yes, sir. It would be a wonderful thing to have happen. He said, okay, well, let's talk about it. And then he took out a pencil and paper and he said, okay, well, we would like 2/3 of the concession revenue. We'd like 80% of all your parking revenue. We would like to get, I don't know if they call them loges or skyboxes, but we had built a huge number around the top of the arena. And he said, and this was the killer. And I want 90% of your loge revenue. And I sat there and I said, Colonel Parker, that's a very, very fine statement you made. But unfortunately, they don't make any sense economically for me. And Jerry Weintraub's partner, who was taken over this meeting, comes up to me. He's the third person in the room. And he says, don't you get it? Do you know who this is? This is Colonel Parker. You can't talk to him that way. I said, I wasn't rude at all. I just said, I can't meet his demands. And so that was that. And so I shook hands with the colonel, said goodbye, and said, I hope we'll meet again. And that was that. I thought so, anyway. A month later, Colonel Parker calls, basically saying, okay, Greenberg, I'll take your terms. And not only did he perform one night, but he performed the following year also for a night. And that's my story. And I think I know who set that question in motion. A wonderful friend of mine named Wayne Gibson.
Yeah.
And in fact, the reason that he is such a wonderful friend is he introduced me to Mark Roberts.
Yes, he is the culprit behind that question. We just have a few minutes left. I want to transition to end blindness abruptly. Can you talk a bit about how that process started? You know, you really did do a great job pulling together a collaborative group and pulling together a scientific advisory board. Can you talk a bit about the process of getting it going, and then we can talk about the awards after that?
Sure. This all began in 1961 when I was in the Detroit hospital being operated on by a surgeon who had told me the day before this stark sentence after examining my eyes. This was the end of the long road of my declining vision. And he said, "Well, son, I've looked at your eyes and you're going to be blind tomorrow." And all I heard was tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. And the next day, Valentine's Day, he operated on me to try and save my eyes, but I became blind, as he had predicted. Now, I was laying in bed after the surgery with my mother next to me, and my pain had nothing to do with me. I couldn't conceive of the pain my mother was going through seeing her son go blind right in front of herself. And after I wrote the book, I came across a lyric by Samuel Barber that really could have been the entire chapter. He said, "Ah, sore was the suffering borne by the body of Mary's son. Sorer still to him was the grief which for his sake came upon his mother." During that period I was in the hospital, I promised God that I would do everything I could for the rest of my life to make sure that no one should go blind. But of course, I was a dropout and penniless and blind. And as a result, no future. Now, if some of you invest in unique opportunities, I wonder if you came and met me when I was 19 and said, "I'd like to invest in you." And obviously, I was at the bottom of life's barrel, as I like to talk about it. But since I had made this solemn promise, I had to live it. So I began, as soon as I got back to my work, to start looking at where the science and technology stood. And in the 60s and 70s, there was really nothing going on that I saw that could be helpful in ending blindness. But then I met Jonas Salk, Dr. Jonas Salk. And he said, don't think about each eye disease. ignore each person or their individual physiological effects. Simply end it. And I walked out of the office. I remember it was my friend Solinwitz's office. And I sat outside for quite some time. And I realized that this is a man who ended polio. And he's telling me that if I want to end blindness, I should just go and end it, whatever all that meant. The 70s was still bereft, in my opinion, in terms of the vision sciences. It was in the 80s that I met Dr. Torsten Wiesel, who had won the Nobel Prize for mapping the visual cortex. And I asked him if he and his colleagues would do some research on the state of optic nerve regeneration. And after a few months, we had a symposium in Washington, and he concluded that, yes, we could regenerate peripheral systems, but not the central nervous system, of which the eye was central. Discouraging, but I felt that at least people are talking to me. And then in the 90s, I had a blessing. I went on the board of Johns Hopkins University. And then President Clinton appointed me to the National Science Board, which for 6 years gave me access to the leading scientists around the world, opportunity to meet them, know them, and work with them. And then I was asked by Congress to chair the Rural Healthcare Corporation to bring needed medical assistance, called telemedicine then, which now become more fashionable, to our rural sectors. And in each case, I found these situations to be extraordinarily interesting and an opportunity to learn. Finally, in 2012, my wife and I decided there ought to be an incentive to the most brilliant minds in the world, this generation. And so we created a prize of $3 million to be given to the person or persons who has done most to end blindness. Because you see, blindness is the oldest cruelty. It's a subversion of the Creator's intent. And it's an injustice that can no longer be tolerated. And my goal is to make sure that someday all God's children can not only feel the sun shining on their faces, but witness with their own eyes its rising and its setting. And then I believe creation will be made whole. That's the background.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Can you spend just another minute or so more talking a bit about the scientific advisory board you pulled together, and then this past fall there was an initial award of the prize, and maybe give us a little bit of the status of where In Blindness 2020 is now and moving forward.
Okay, great. In a minute.
You've got plenty of time. We're fine.
Oh, no. So I I had an opportunity to go to become a regular participant in the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. And there was a dinner one night honoring 11 Nobel laureates. And the editor of Nature magazine was the moderator. And I said to my wife, when in the course of my life will I ever have an opportunity to talk with 11 Nobel laureates? So I asked her to help me go see Philip Campbell, the editor, who was moderating the program, which he did reluctantly. And I said to Mr. Campbell, here's what I'd like to say to the Nobel laureates, because they played a prominent role in my life. And shockingly, he agreed, because the only people who were supposed to talk were the Nobel laureates. And so I wrote my speech from the time I got up from my table to the time I took the microphone. And I had no idea. It was, as I was incautious in the extreme to do something like that. But there was such applause that I couldn't believe it. And a lot of people came up to thank me and congratulate me. But Mrs. Eric Kandel said, you've got to meet my husband. He's right over here. I want you to meet him. I met the great Eric Kandel, who had won the Nobel Prize for discovering the neuronal patterns of the brain. And we hit it off. I said, Professor Kandel, can I come up and visit you in your office at Columbia? He said, sure. Why don't you come and have lunch? What do you want for lunch? And that began a multi-year relationship with him. And I told him what we were trying to do. And he said that it was something he'd like to think about. And called me shortly thereafter and said, Greenberg, we're doing a brain series on the Charlie Rose Show, and I'd like you to be on it. I said, Eric, I'm not a TV guy, so I appreciate your offer. It was very generous of you to do that. And that was that. And Eric and I didn't talk for a few months. And then he called me and he said, okay, Greenberg, you are now going to be on the Charlie Rose Show with me and some other scientists. I knew intonation, even I knew that if I had replied in the negative, that would be the end of our relationship, or so I thought. And I accepted, and I went on the Charlie Rose Show. And Eric, that solidified my relationship with Dr. Kandel. And I started talking to him about what other people might be helpful in this quest, and asked him if he'd go on our scientific advisory board, which was nascent at that time. And when he accepted, there was another Nobel laureate named Richard Axel, one of the most astounding human beings I've ever met. And I asked him if he would join, and he agreed that he would. And then from my own Johns Hopkins, a woman named Carol Greider, who had also won a Nobel Prize, and I discussed it with her, and she said she'd be delighted to help. And then I talked to Dr. Joshua Sains, who is the director of brain science at Harvard, and Carla Schatz at Stanford. There were 12 people who I felt represented the best of science in the world, and that I would entrust them with making decisions about the prize. And this took a few years by the time we got everybody settled and understanding the rules and regulations. And I asked Dr. Jeremy Nathans from Hopkins, who is a brilliant man, and he, like 3 or 4 others, I think will ultimately get the Nobel Prize as well, to chair it, which he did and did a masterful job. That's how we got the Scientific Advisory Board.
I hate to draw us to a close. People, I do appreciate everybody kind of listening in and bearing with us. We've gone just a smidge long. I will tell folks there is much more to the story. We have scratched just the edge of the surface, and there is more information out there, and we're happy to share that information. But I will try to respect everybody's time and kind of bring us to a bit of an unnatural close. Sandy, I'm going to ask you one last question. If you could go back and tell Sanford Greenberg Sr. in high school something, what would you tell Sandy Greenberg in high school? What advice would you give him? What is important? What would you tell him?
First of all, if I could just finish off with one more sentence.
Oh, please, absolutely. Yes.
On ending blindness. If there is anyone out there who wants to continue this journey that we have been on to end blindness, I would welcome your participation. And if you have any interest, if you'd be kind enough to be in touch with Mark Roberts, that would be wonderful. I would welcome it.
Fabulous. No, absolutely.
What would I tell? Well, it's not a response about business. I'll say that. Look, one of my majors in graduate school was philosophy. So Marcus Aurelius, in his book Meditations, said, pointing to the vanities of humankind, talked about fame is fleeting, the soul's a spinning top, etc. And then in the end said, so what is there then that can escort a man through life? And his answer is philosophy. I say that because I believe it, and I've lived my philosophy. And as you know, the Patch of Grass with Arthur was my first step in opening my eyes up to the beauty in the world. Einstein said, the most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion which stands at the cradle of true art and science. Whoever does not know it, whoever does not marvel, can no longer wonder, is as good as dead, and his eyes are dim. I say that if you can no longer wonder or no longer marvel, then you'll miss the magic of daily living, the magnificent, gargantuan essence, the beauty and the joy that can be uncovered within all the things we encounter on any day. Or if you're walking with a loved one on vacation, or as in my case, standing on the banks of the Potomac River, waiting for something extraordinary to happen. And it always does.
Sandy, thank you so much. It's such a blessing just to always talk with you, and thank you for this time you've shared with everybody and myself.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, iConnections, and Raul for his kind introduction, and also want to thank Wayne for adding some spice to this little conversation. Thank you, Mark.
Gentlemen, I actually have written some notes, but I'm going to tear them up because I'm so blown away by this conversation. It has really, really touched me, moved me. And even though you don't have your eyesight, you have such a visionary, and you've given us such an insight into your life, but also how we as human beings should think about life. And you epitomize the one thing which a lot of young people don't have today, which is resilience. And it's incredible to see. And you are a role model, and I salute you. Thank you so much for taking your time and being a guest of ours. Mark, as always, you're incredible. Thank you both, gentlemen. If anyone has any questions, either for Mark or for Sandy, please contact your iConnections sales rep or email us at the website, and we will be sure to pass on those messages. Thank you, everyone. Gentlemen, stay safe, and we'll speak to you soon. Thank you, iConnections, for putting this event on.
Thank you all.
Thank you.